Private Members Club to discuss how to quell public anger over rising bills and sewage spills. This at an estimated cost of £1,200. This does not appear to me that either the Environment Agency or Ofwat are independent of the water companies. Quite the opposite. In a cosy chat over dinner about how to alter public opinion without actually addressing the root cause of the problem seems hardly likely to reassure the public. On Tuesday this week, Southern Water was fined £330,000 over a raw sewage spill at a rural beauty spot that killed more than 2,000 fish, with staff ignoring an alarm about the emergency for 5 hours. The YMCA Fairthorne Manor, an outdoor activity centre popular for school trips, had to stop water activities for 10 days after the incident and cancel more than 1,000 sessions. The health implications of sewage are why Liberal Democrats have previously called for sewage sickness victims to receive compensation, and we repeat that call today. It is not right that as water companies make large profits, swimmers get sick. If someone is poisoned by sewage, they should be compensated for it. A recent report by Surfers Against Sewage found that the number of people who fell ill after entering water between October 22 and September 23 was 1,924. This is 3 times the number reported in the previous year. The sewage spill that Southern Water was fined for on Tuesday, and many other spills like it, show the need for an effective Environment Agency. My Lords, DEFRA is heavily dependent on the monitoring and intervention of the Environment Agency. However, cutting the Environment Agency budget from £170 million in 2009-10 down to £76 million in 2019-20 is not likely to assist this hard-pressed organisation to act effectively. The general rule of life is you get what you pay for. It is essential the Environment Agency is provided with adequate funding to conduct inspections and take remedial action. My Lords, according to a Guardian article on the 13th of February, the Levelling Up Secretary Michael Gove proposed an amendment to the LERB which would strike out the directive on preventing extra sewage going into waterways in sensitive areas by either updating infrastructure or by buying biodiversity credits. The Secretary of State's action would allow developers to ignore the rules which were so strenuously fought for in this chamber by the noble Lord the Duke of Wellington and others. The government are not taking this issue seriously. There is then the issue of axing the right of developers to connect to already overloaded sewage systems, not currently anywhere on the horizon. My Lords, on Tuesday afternoon, as I sat in this chamber waiting for next business, a message came through to my private email from Southern Water, of which I am a customer. The heading was, "Tired of hearing about storm releases? Us too." There then followed some excellent nature-based solutions, which they are prioritising. Obviously, they were trying to head off criticism. However, when I got home, I watched the local television news, delayed due to the football overrun, and saw the news of Southern Water's fine I referred to earlier. This sewage discharge was in the next village to where I live. The worst aspect of this is that it took from 2019 until this week to come to court and be dealt with. No wonder water companies include the cost of possible fines in their business plans. To them, it appears to be all part of their operation. My Lords, the country cannot wait any longer. The countryside and our waterways are submerged by pollution. A radical overhaul is needed of the way in which water and sewage companies operate, and a more accountable replacement of Ofwat needs to be delivered without delay. I beg to move.
Hear, hear.
The question is that this motion be agreed to.
My Lords, I declare my interest as on the register. I co-chair the All-Party Parliamentary Water Group. all-party parliamentary water group. Last year I chaired a study organised by Sewage, the Chartered Institution of Water and Environmental Management, into bioresources strategy. I also worked with the Water Regulator for Scotland, the Water Industry Commission between 2015 and 2018. At the outset, may I congratulate the noble lady Baroness Bakewell on securing this timely debate on river pollution and the case for regulation of private water companies. I, for one, recognise that privatisation has permitted the massive investment required to move UK waters from being one of the dirtiest in Europe to upgrading our drinking water, rivers and bathing waters to infinitely better quality than it was in the 1980s. We can always improve regulation, though some might say that there is already a wealth of regulators for private water companies. Ofwat, the Environment Agency, the Drinking Water Inspectorate, and now the Office for Environmental Protection. If we examine the causes of pollution of our rivers, a recent phenomenon has been surface water flooding, first recognised in 2007, with runoff from our roads spilling into combined sewers. Does my noble friend the Minister, who I welcome to his place today, think it is right that national highways authorities are not held accountable for surface water runoff? There is also the case of inappropriate developments whereby water companies are required to connect wastewater, sewage, to antiquated infrastructure, causing further spills when mixed with floodwater, entering therefore the combined sewers. Large-scale developments built in inappropriate places, such as I'll just finish my sentence if I may. We are on a timer, so I'll take advice if we're permitted to take it. Does the clock stop if I take an intervention? No. So I'm afraid I can't. Inappropriate developments whereby water companies are required to connect wastewater to antiquated infrastructure cause further spills when mixing with floodwater. Large-scale developments built in inappropriate places such as Zone B floodplains compound this with poor connections. My lords, we must tackle problems of sewage at source before it enters the rivers and the sea. While the government makes the case for building on floodplains in certain circumstances, this should not be encouraged. In any event, such homes will not be insured under flood raise schemes if built after 2009. I would also like to raise the vexed issue of missed connections. The government made 2 commitments under the Storm Overflows Discharge Reduction Plan which could help address this issue, and they are to give water companies the right to repair defective drains on private property and to give water companies the right to alter drainage systems on private property to reduce impermeable areas where connected to the combined sewer network. An important part of tackling misconnections is getting these drains on private land so water companies can take action, as the majority of misconnections are on private land. But will the government also allow water companies access to government-owned land, such as hospitals and schools, to make the necessary repair work and to repair drainage separation work where required? This measure alone would prevent excess water entering combined sewers. Having examined the causes of pollutions in our rivers, is there a case for further regulation of private water companies? Water companies have a positive role to play in areas such as creating natural flood defences, as the noble Baroness Lady Bakewell pointed out, particularly by working with farmers and others. I pay tribute to the work of Yorkshire Water and United Utilities in this area. DEFRA should encourage other private sector players to contribute in this regard. What plans does my noble friend the Minister and his department have to do so? The Slow the Flow scheme in Pickering, with which I was associated, is a good example of a natural flood defence combined with a small reservoir, not an over-engineered project which the noble Baroness Bakewell objected to, though all those involved were from the public sector. I would urge the government to lever more private sector funding in this regard. If we're to follow through linking remuneration to performance, then I invite my noble friend the Minister and his department to look at the corollary of this, giving water companies the tool to do the job. The government promised in this place and the other place that Schedule 3 to the Flood and Water Management Act 2010 will be implemented as it has been in Wales. Will my noble friend confirm that this will happen in England before the election? It is extremely important that we stop the automatic right to connect, whereby water companies are expected to connect pipes from 3, 4 or 5 bedroomed homes to antiquated Victorian pipes that simply cannot take the amount of wastewater and sewage coming out of these new builds. The government must insist on mandatory SUDs, sustainable drainage systems, for all new builds, and I hope that they will commit to an ambitious programme of retrofitting to existing developments where appropriate. Obviously, that raises the question of who will maintain SUDs, which is an open question at the moment. Will the government look favourably on rewarding farmers for restoring water on flood land? According to the NFU, over half the most fertile farmland in Britain are floodplains. And the farming community and landowners are performing a public good by preventing communities downstream from flooding. However, there is great uncertainty how farmers can benefit from public funds, and often this flooding will include sewage. Can my noble friend clarify who will be eligible to apply for both the flood recovery framework and the farming recovery fund, and what level of damages can be recovered? Equally, will DEFRA recognise the recognition that farmers play in this regard, storing flood water as a public good? Will the government look positively at a whole catchment area approach and more slow the flow schemes, such as successfully implemented in Pickering and elsewhere, protecting downstream communities from flooding? I applaud the action the government have taken on holding directors to account, particularly the instruction they've given to Ofwat and the work Ofwat have done on executive pay. Ofwat have been very clear that companies need to demonstrate that performance-related executive remuneration is linked to performance for customers and the environment. In June last year, Ofwat confirmed that where companies do not demonstrate executive pay is linked to performance, it will stop companies recovering the cost of bonuses from consumers. I welcome the level of investment announced in the 5-year business plan that Ofwat has yet to approve. It will factor in £96 billion in the next investment period, 2025 to 2030, of which £11 billion will be allocated to reduce overflow spills. But the noble lady Baroness Bakewell identified an area which has only been recognised for spend, and that is innovation, in 2014. And I hope that Ofwat will go much further, recognising the natural flood defences to which the noble lady referred as innovative projects under the spending review, which I think will help many of the issues that the noble lady identified. We don't want over-engineered projects, we want natural flood defences, and these schemes have to be approved as part of the price review. Finally, the NAO report in November 2023 made a number of very apt recommendations to increase resilience to future flood events, such as reprofiling capital spend, maximising long-term value for money, and ensuring flexibility to switch money from capital spend to assets management. My preference is to establish a single budget for all flood spending. Finally, will my noble friend look favourably on the use of SUDs and natural flood defences to ensure no overspill of raw sewage into combined sewers, so they won't enter the rivers, to look at a whole catchment area management approach, to make highways authorities responsible for water runoff of pollution from these surfaces into combined sewers, address the issue of misconnections and permit water companies to enter private land and government property in schools and hospitals, give water companies the right to alter drainage systems, consider the recommendation from CWIM for a comprehensive independent review of water management, inform the public of importance of water efficiency and address all the recommendations of the NOA report of November last year.
My Lords, I thank the noble Lady Bakewell of Hardington Mandeville for securing this debate and congratulate her on her superb speech in setting out the issues. I will concentrate on regulatory issues. Key principles of effective regulation are that the regulator must be independent, must levy effective sanctions, be publicly accountable, and must empower stakeholders to curb abuses. Water and sewage regulators fail these key tests. In any system of regulation, capture of the regulators by the regulated is a recurring problem. However, this is the starting position in the water industry. 2/3 of England's biggest water companies employ key executives who previously worked at Ofwat. Water company directors and chairs of Ofwat and the Environment Agency regularly meet at exclusive clubs to discuss how to quell public anger over bill rises and sewage dumping. The cost of these lavish lunches and dinners is passed to customers, but no agenda papers or minutes of such meetings are made publicly available. And we all know that secrecy breeds corruption, and the water industry is full of that. The revolving doors deepen cognitive capture, and the coziness is all too evident. Water companies have operating profit margin of 35%, even though they have no competition. Water bills have risen by 363% since privatisation, and over 40% in real terms. Up to 28% of customer charges cover the interest paid on debt, which would not be necessary if Ofwat had been vigilant and curbed high leverage at water companies. It completely failed to protect customers. In the debate last week, on 22nd January, I drew attention to the number of times some of the water companies have been sanctioned since 2010. I gave example of United Utilities, which has been sanctioned 215 times. In reply, the noble minister seemed to regard that as a sign of success. Imagine an offender hauled in front of the same judge every 3 weeks for identical offence, and then is given a puny fine only to re-offend again. Nobody would consider that to be a regulatory success, but the minister thought it was somehow a success story. So hopefully the minister will explain why the government considers repeat offences by the water companies to be a success. That was just an easy question for the minister. So despite the repeat offences, bonuses continue to flow. And again last week, in response to my question that my suggestion that customers should elect water company directors and vote on executive pay, the minister said, and I quote, remuneration committees for each water company independently determine the appropriate level of remuneration for their water company, end of quote. My lords, this is simply not true. Firstly, remuneration committees are staffed by non-executive directors who owe their position to favours from the executive board. They have absolutely no independence from the executive board, and they very rarely bite the hand that actually feeds them. And none are actually a substitute for direct representation by customers on the company boards. Secondly, the minister added, and again I quote, Ofwat expects water companies to take into account the legitimate concerns of stakeholders when making decisions on the application of remuneration policies, end of quote. My lords, every opinion poll has shown that people are really concerned about high bills, pollution, lack of investment and poor regulation. Relying upon the failed structures and practices cannot give us effective regulation. Yet the minister was defending that for some reason. Maybe he's had second thoughts since, I do not know. In the debate, again on 22nd February, the Minister defended water companies with the claim that since privatisation, £215 billion has been invested in infrastructure. My Lords, I do not have any confidence in that number because that number has been manufactured by dubious accounting practices. And I will just give two examples, both relating to the accounts published by Thames Water. These are the accounts for year 2022 and 23. Firstly, on page 134 of those accounts, the company states, and I quote, that it capitalises expenditure relating to water and wastewater infrastructure where such expenditure enhances assets or increases the capacity of the network. Maintenance expenditure is taken to the income statement in the period in which it is incurred. Differentiating between enhancement and maintenance works is subjective. Now, what does that mean? What that means is that the amounts which are capitalized to show higher investment cannot be independently corroborated. This just depends on the whims of the directors. There's absolutely no solidity. So can I ask the Minister to write to the House after this debate and say how much of the repair and maintenance cost has actually been capitalised since privatisation by water companies, so that we can remove that from the 215 billion? Secondly, on page 143 of the Thames annual accounts, it states, and I quote, 215.2 million of the borrowing costs were capitalised in the period. And it gives a comparison for year 2022 of 114.8 million. So the investment made by Thames in those 2 years alone has been inflated by £330 million. The crazy logic of this policy is that when a company mends leaks by borrowing money compared to the one that uses retained earnings, it is somehow investing more and its assets are worth more. That simply is not true. We know a company which used such imprudent policies, and that was Carillion. And I have a slight declaration to make here. I was advisor to the Work and Pensions Committee for that investigation, and we know what happened to Carillion. And this is where water companies are heading, with a full blessing of the government, Ofwat, and all the other regulators. So can I again ask the Minister to write to the House and explain how much interest actually has been capitalised by water companies since privatisation? And what are the consequences of such practices? Are they just going to go the same way as Carillion, which I fear they are? And Ofwat certainly has no financial nous to check these things. So after 35 years of failure, we can all see that the current regulatory structures are highly deficient. We can't have that. We need to change it. So Ofwat and the Environment Agency need to be replaced by bodies which are pluralistic, with direct representation of stakeholders on their boards. The regulators and the regulated don't need to have a hostile relationship, but there has to be a distance between them. They can't be in each other's pockets. They can't just be cosy. Regulators must owe a duty of care to stakeholders so that they can actually be sued for failing the public. At the moment, that is virtually impossible. All significant board meetings must be in the open so that we can all see how appropriate evidence submitted to regulators is weighted, filtered, or acted upon. At the moment, there is a complete secrecy. All board minutes, working and agenda papers also need to be publicly available. If the Minister possibly feels uncomfortable with those suggestions, it would be helpful to know, why is he afraid of openness, democracy? Why is he afraid of empowering stakeholders and the public at large? Because we need to bring public pressure upon the water industry and its regulators so that they can clean up their act.
My Lords, it's such a pleasure to follow the noble Lord Secker, who really does his homework, and I do advocate the government benches reading his speech in Hansard, just to make sure they've got the full picture. I want to congratulate the noble lady, Baroness Bakewell, for bringing this topic again. When I was thinking about what I might say, I did wonder if I should just print off my speech from 6 months ago or a year ago or 2 years ago or whatever. We have debated this issue a lot. There's a strength of feeling here because, and the Noble Lord the Minister might say, in his innocence, he might stand up and say, but we're doing more than any other government has ever done on this issue. And that might be true, but unfortunately, the situation has got worse and the government isn't doing enough. Now, we've had some really good briefings on this. The Rivers Trust produced a very good report, and they've said things like, no single stretch of river in England or Northern Ireland is in good overall health. That's shameful. They also say, in England, 85% of river stretches failed to reach good ecological health, and toxic chemicals pollute every stretch of English rivers. What a legacy this government has left us. I mean, this will come up on the doorsteps. I'm going to make sure it does, if I have anything to do with it, and the government will be shamed. We also had a very good briefing from Sustain, and they make the point that the main cause of river pollution is in fact livestock farming, you know, chickens and things, which is perfectly true, but that doesn't mean that sewage isn't going to be important, because somehow the general public has actually heard the word sewage and will ask questions about it. We've also had a briefing from Windrush against sewage pollution, and they talk about the inadequate monitoring, that there simply isn't enough data to actually know the full picture, and that's something that the government has not taken seriously. And also a freshwater future briefing, and they call for regulation of private water companies. Now, clearly, we're all tired of talking about this, and the government replying in platitudes about how, you know, it's going to be fine, you know, they've done everything anyone possible, and you have not done everything you could possibly do. And I think perhaps even the two noble lords on the front bench know that water regulation has failed. I would be very disappointed if they did not know that basic fact. And I've got all sorts of facts and figures here, but quite honestly, the noble Lord, Lord Prem, has done all the facts and figures. So I'm going to try to cut those bits out of my speech. Thank you. So I think it's time that all politicians, all political parties, question and reject their ideological belief in water privatisation. It has failed. And once you're free of that ideological sort of straitjacket, then when the water companies say, we will go bankrupt if you don't let us raise the average water bills by £150 a year, you can say, not a problem. You know, we can take you over. That's fine, you fail, and we'll buy you for 50 pence or whatever. The water companies had the money, the public money, to invest, and instead they paid it out in dividends. So either they can do what they were paid to do already, or they can go bankrupt, and, as I say, we can buy them. I mean, an even better solution is put forward by the organisation, the charity We Own It, and they suggest that instead of these stupid paltry fines that the water companies keep getting thrown at them, which they pay quite happily because they don't care. It's not much money. What we could do is take shares from them every time and be quite strict and be tough about it. And then, of course, you know, we'd have them in no time. So the predicted £150 a year rise, which they in bills which they are insulting us with at the moment, what they are saying is that they need it to invest over the next 27 years. But that 57 billion that the government is offering is actually the same amount of money that those water companies have paid to shareholders in the previous 27 years. So where is the guarantee that any money we give to these water companies is actually going to be spent on the things that we care about? And I would argue we have absolutely no guarantee. Of course, Ofwat has failed. The Environmental Agency has, and I feel very sad about that, the Environment Agency has failed. And instead of our regulators acting years ago to clamp down on CEO bonuses and shareholder dividends, they're still going to private dinner clubs with the water industry to discuss how to quell the public anger at sewage and the rising bills. Now, as I said, there will be anger at the next general election over this. The cost of living is going to be the major concern, but sewage will come up. And I've had quite a lot of people saying to me, oh, we should just, take these CEOs to court, all the top execs, take them to court, throw them in jail, and forget about them, basically. Now, I'm not a big fan of putting people into prison anyway, but I think what we should do with all these top execs is to actually give them community service. They should be out there on the riverbanks, on the beaches, clearing up the mess that they've made. I mean, a couple of years of doing that, and I think possibly other CEOs would learn that you actually can't carry on polluting our natural resources in that way. I'm going to cut huge chunks out now, which I'm sure everybody is going to be very happy about. Now, local campaigners in West Oxfordshire have worked with the District Council to ensure that planning applications have conditions set for Thames Water to upgrade illegal sewage systems before accepting the occupancy of new housing. And the effectiveness of the conditions is being tested with the first examples underway. And the Environment Agency has been prodded into action, and on one application of 1,450 houses north of Oxford, it has said clearly that the Oxford Sewage Works is operating illegally and has failed to upgrade despite the water company having had the money years ago. Now, I don't want there to be a shortage of housing. I don't want us to stop building new housing, but what I do want to stop is our polluting some very, very precious ecosystems. So this same rule that I've just talked about would apply to any new housing served by the Oxford Sewage Works and every other illegally operating sewage works in the country. It will stop a new deluge of sewage being dumped into local rivers due to the overloaded system. So I want to ask the Minister, how many sewage works around the country are currently operating illegally and don't have the capacity to handle the existing levels of sewage? This is a very, very important question. And if we don't have the data on that, we really ought to. And so perhaps the Noble Lord the Minister could write to me and write to everybody about that, because it is an absolutely crucial question. You can't fix a problem if you don't know what it is and how big it is. And lastly, can the Minister explain how water companies that are blocking new housing from being occupied and have never invested the money given from them to produce a modern sewage system can now be expected to do so? We have let the water companies run rampant over our very precious land and rivers, waterways, all sorts of ecosystems, and it's time we stopped them.
My Lords, it is a pleasure to speak in this debate. I want to thank Baroness Bakewell and all those who are speaking. I will talk about the scale of the pollution problem in our rivers, the causes, and I will suggest some possible solutions. I want to say that the scale of the government's overall environmental ambitions is to be commended. This is the first government that has set a target to leave nature in a better place than it found it. But there is much to do and time is short. My overall message is more must be urgently done at scale and at pace now to meet the targets that the government has set itself. Clear plans, clear policy direction, clear timescales for action, monitoring regimes and a clear and consistent direction of travel and political messaging are all vital to secure the planning, investment and action needed to achieve these objectives at scale and on time. Water quality was awful, but thanks mainly to EU measures and their enforcement and monitoring, it improved in the past. Progress is either slipping back or is stagnant at best. Nowhere is the scale of the challenge clearer than the daily scandal of raw sewage being discharged into our waterways, unabated, while all the while water company bosses continue to pay themselves millions in bonuses, with seeming impunity from the harm their companies do. Our rivers and inland waterways are in a desperately sorry state, and the combined impacts of sewage discharges, pollution from farming and agriculture, and pollution from chemicals, and our road networks and urban spaces are taking their toll. The recently published Rivers Trust report states that 0% of our rivers are in good overall status. 0 are in higher overall status. 23 are classified as in poor or bad overall status. 85% of river stretches fall below good ecological standards, and only 15% achieve good above ecological health status. Their report found that very little has changed or improved since their last full report in 2019. Worryingly, river sampling has also decreased, with nearly 6% fewer river stretches receiving health clarifications compared to 2019. What a sorry situation this is. From poo sticks to the simple pleasures in life of sitting by a cooling river on a warm day, or the 7.5 million people who regularly wild swim, our rivers and lakes are precious and life-affirming. People care passionately, as Baroness Jones has said, about our rivers. They occupy a deep and sacred place in our natural soul and well-being. Their health is an election-defining issue, and one this government needs to invest more commitment and energy into. The government should be aware there is a reason for the Liberal Democrats going on, and at times on, about sewage in our rivers. Yeah. It is not just because my party care about these issues, it is because we know that your voters care just as much. My party is committed to protecting our natural environment, and that protection will be at the heart of our overall policy approach. Everyone should be able to enjoy access to nature free of this mess and risk to their health. The water companies have failed to invest in water infrastructure, especially at a time when interest rates were historically low. In 2019, for example, DEFRA's Water for Life paper found that only 1% of public sewers were replaced between 2000 and 2008. At that continued rate, it would take 800 years, or 10 times longer than the life cycle, to replace all of them. This lack of investment has continued till today, with Ofwat finding a £587 million water company underspend for the years 2020 to 2023. At the same time, the shareholders continue to receive record bonuses. Poor regulation and enforcement across several sectors are making things worse. The Environment Agency has seen its environmental budget more than half in the last 10 years, from 170 million to 76 million in 2019-20. As a result, it is struggling to monitor and enforce the rules. Ofwat has similarly failed to hold water companies to account. It has over-prioritised low bills to customers over the need for investment in networks and environmental protections. We've seen a revolving door between Ofwat and the water companies, and the question remains, who regulates the regulators? We need clear and enforceable statutory regulations for long-term improvements in overall water health to be added to the Environment Act 2021. Sewage may be in the public consciousness and in too many cases people's nostrils, but it is only a small part of the overall pollution problem. Land management practices must change. This is an issue that the government has failed to tackle. Elms has been rushed. Too much money is given to big agricultural businesses, and our small farmers are excluded and are suffering. Many more small-scale farmers must be brought into the scheme, and more help must be provided to help them make applications. The programme must adequately compensate farmers for the nature-friendly practices we all need and depend on. There is far too little monitoring of our waterways and far too little understanding of the dangerous cocktail of chemicals and forever chemicals that are still present. Can I ask the Minister, when does the government plan to bring forward its chemical strategy, a key call of the recent OEP report? The impacts of climate change are real, and they are happening now. The average UK winter has become around 1 degree warmer and 15% wetter over the past century. We are seeing more rain, and it must go somewhere. We must work to separate rainwater from our sewage systems. Climate change puts increased pressure on the systems and overwhelms them. Heat will increase pressure for water abstraction, and floods bring increased risks of pollution events. I do warmly welcome the 25 million of government money announced last week to work with nature, not against it, to help with flood management. A welcome sign of a change of direction, but we could have had 250 million and it would still not have been enough. We need more whole catchment area, nature-based approaches to slow water, hold it, release it slowly, to protect soils, to filter rainwater prior to entering our waterways. We must do more to work with nature, not against it, in an age of extreme weather. We need long-term plans and greater ambitions from this government. Ambition must be accompanied by consistent political will, determined action, adequate investment and regulatory regimes that are statutory, well-funded, enforced and fit for purpose. My party are clear. We are determined and committed to real change in these areas. We will transform the private water companies into public benefit companies. Our view is that Ofwat has failed to get to grips with the problems and to find solutions. Our policy is to abolish Ofwat and replace it with a more effective regulator with more powers to directly intervene with speed and much needed enforcement teeth. We will ensure that there is more adequate funding for regular monitoring of all our waterways. Liberal Democrats are also committed to introducing a sewage tax on water company profits to fund the clean-up of the most polluted inland waterways and our coastline. We will also introduce compensation for swimmers and others who fall sick after exercising in water. These are our policies for change. I kindly ask the Minister, what plans does the government have to offer?
My Lords, I thank my noble friend Baroness Bakewell for tabling this very important topic for debate. My noble friend has described the consequences for our rivers of the discharging of raw sewage from storm overflows. The health problems that follow can be very serious. But I will start with some history. Nearly 170 years ago, sewage was discharged into the rivers that served our great cities. In London, it was obviously the Thames, and one hot summer in 1858, the smell that resulted from the raw effluent was dubbed the Great Stink. It affected Parliament to such an extent that the curtains were soaked in chloride of lime in a vain attempt to reduce the overpowering smell. The failure to deal with a long-running discharge of raw sewage into the Thames had literally got up the noses of MPs and peers. So, of course, something had to be done, and it was. The great Joseph Bazalgette was a civil engineer who then set to work and created the sewage system for central London, including for Parliament. Standards for sewage systems for the whole country followed in 1875, when a Conservative Prime Minister, Disraeli, overcame the laissez-faire attitude of his party and passed the Public Health Act, which required local authorities, as they were then, to create or repair sewers at significant cost to ratepayers. Now, it is salutary to think that over 150 years later, that investment in the sewerage infrastructure has been so neglected that today communities across the country face a modern equivalent of the Great Stink. In Yorkshire, where I am happy to live, the rivers create a beautiful environment, as well as providing water for habitats, a focus for recreation, but also water abstraction for domestic consumption. Sadly, too often these great rivers are also used to carry sewage from storm overflows. I hasten to add that despite all else that pollutes our rivers, the water companies and the Drinking Water Inspectorate ensure a very high quality of drinking water. These are some of the more recent incidents. Over 2020 and 2021, two Yorkshire rivers, the River Nid and the River Wharfe, received approximately 1.4 billion litres of untreated wastewater. For wastewater, read raw sewage. The River Nid saw 870 sewage dump incidents in 2022, according to the Environment Agency figures. And testing of water pollution at the time in the River Nid showed the harmful bacteria E. coli was at concerningly high, and I quote, levels, concerningly high levels. In 2016, the Environment Agency received a report of pollution in Hookstone Beck in Harrogate. Investigating officers traced it to the nearby overflow, which had blocked. The investigation found that almost 1,500 fish had been killed and water quality affected for 2.5 kilometres downstream. A series of further blockages and discharges took place in the following months. Now, these are just some of the pollution incidents relating to discharging of raw sewage in our great Yorkshire rivers. And the questions for the Noble Lord the Minister are, why have these pollution incidents been permitted without earlier intervention by the regulators and the government? The EU Water Framework Directive has been retained by the government as retained EU law. And prior to 2019, the Water Framework Directive was a key driver to very significant capital investment by water companies in their wastewater treatment works and sewage systems. In Yorkshire, there were some very large schemes to improve both wastewater treatment facilities as well as the system attached to it. Now, in 2023, the Environment Improvement Plan only, and I quote, requires water companies to have eliminated all adverse ecological impact from sewage discharges at all, and I quote again, sensitive sites by 2035, and all from other storm overflows by 2050. Now, the government is apparently satisfied that raw sewage discharges can continue for a further 25 years. And what is worse is that these aims in the plan are not even legally binding. Further, the government storm overflows discharge reduction plan of 2022 set a target for 75% of overflows close to high priority sites like SS3SIs and so on by 2035. Now, this is a considerable dilution of the Water Framework Directive, which set a date to restore all surface water bodies, rivers, streams, etc., to good ecological status by December 2027. And yet, the government is apparently okaying 2035 for the most sensitive areas. 150 years ago, a government was able to accept both that it had a responsibility and, secondly, that taking responsibility meant having a duty to act. The situation we suffer today is that Conservative governments have been keen to outsource these critical responsibilities of providing clean drinking water and treating sewage, so that the end result can be discharged to rivers or the sea without causing pollution. It is time for the government to appreciate that discharging raw sewage into watercourses is not acceptable. It is a public health scandal. But of course, public health is underfunded, as is the Environment Agency, to tackle these health challenges. Disraeli understood that his government would be judged by the approach to public health. That same challenge exists today, and we are yet to see the Conservative government rising effectively, with determination, to that challenge.
Lords, I declare my agricultural interest, which may be relevant to this debate. I also want to congratulate Baroness Bakewell for securing this debate. I'm slightly saddened to hear from various sides party political views on this matter. In my opinion, this is not a party political issue. I think all parties in this House, and those with no party affiliation, share a determination to try and do something about this very serious situation. Because there is no doubt that pollution in our rivers affects the whole population, and there is wide public support for legislation to clean up our rivers and our beaches. Unfortunately, despite many improvements made by this House to the 2021 Environment Act, and despite various plans and intentions published by the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, by the Environment Agency and by Ofwat, the situation does not appear to be improving. The Office for Environmental Protection, a new agency created by the Environment Act, has stated in its recent annual report, the current state of the water environment is not satisfactory. Despite historic improvements, the pace of change has now stalled. It is well known that only a small proportion of our rivers are in a good ecological state. A number of noble lords have mentioned that. There was a report published earlier this week by the Rivers Trust, also referred to by a number of noble lords. In that report, the rivers of this country are described as being in a desperate state. They are plagued by sewage, chemical, nutrient, and plastic pollution. So what can be done to encourage an improvement in our rivers? As the Office for Environmental Protection clearly state in their report, the government's ambitions can only be achieved with effective management of the farmed landscape and engagement with the nation's farmers and landowners. Unfortunately, the rollout of the environmental land management schemes has been slow, and this will have impeded the reduction in the pollution in our rivers coming from agricultural activities. We have been slow in dealing with the slurry from intensive farming systems located in certain river catchment areas. But the inexcusable cause of river pollution is the continuing discharge of raw and untreated sewage. This has been happening for decades, and planning authorities throughout the country have been insufficiently insistent on improvements to sewage treatment plants to cope with new housing developments and so many house improvements. The various parts of central and local government have been insensitive to the scale of sewage pollution entering rivers and lakes. And with hindsight, I think it is now clear that the regulatory structure created when the water companies were privatised over 30 years ago has been shown to be inadequate. In the short term, it will be necessary to enforce, to a greater extent, compliance with new regulations for slurry management and the control of other farm waste. For the water companies, it will probably be necessary for Ofwat to insist on an even greater level of investment in sewage treatments, including where possible nature-based systems. I know many ambitious investment plans have been announced, but I fear they are not adequate for the dire situation in which we find ourselves. I also fear, and it's uncomfortable to say this, that this all may involve increases in water charges greater than the rate of inflation, but this must be coupled with a reduction or elimination of dividends until the discharges have been reduced to a minimum. In the medium term, I believe we must also review the structure of regulation. I realise this would be complex and the transition could be disruptive. As the Minister and all the party spokesmen are here participating in this debate, I would ask them to discuss with their respective colleagues whether all the parties should not include in their manifestos at the next election to a commitment to an independent review of the structure of the regulation of the water industry. Such a review might well conclude, as I have concluded, that it is necessary to have a single regulator rather than the continuing splitting of the responsibilities between the Water Services Regulation Authority, Ofwat, and the Environment Agency. The water companies are, of course, monopolies in their own geographic areas and must therefore be regulated. And I cannot think of other monopolies where the regulation is divided between two different agencies. I do not suggest that it would not be complicated and have other consequences to change the manner in which water companies are regulated and held to account, and any change would not have an immediate effect. But the present system of regulation has meant that it has taken us decades to realise the full extent of the pollution damage, while the industry has become increasingly indebted and yet has paid out regularly dividends to shareholders who in many cases are not the public shareholders who originally bought shares from the government, but are private equity firms who may not share the same environmental objectives as the government or the public. And some noble lords have mentioned bonuses, and I agree that it is rather shocking how much has been paid out as bonuses to companies who have been polluting regularly our rivers. I realise, my lords, that there is no quick fix for the current state of our rivers, lakes and beaches. But we must continue to keep pressure on the government, on local authorities, and on the regulators to reduce the discharges of sewage and reduce the agricultural waste entering our river systems. What I think is that a greater sense of urgency is now required.
My Lords, Baroness Harris of Richmond will be joining us remotely. I invite Baroness Harris to speak.
My Lords, I too thank my noble friend Baroness Bakewell of Hardington Mandeville on her excellent speech and on securing this important debate. It follows on from the one held in the Chamber on water and sewage companies' directors' remuneration on the 22nd of February, and I urge your Lordships to read that debate closely. I'm going to talk about my local river, the River Swale, said to be the fastest flowing river in England. It is supposed to be watched over by Yorkshire Water. This company was privatised in 1989, at which time it had no debt. That debt is now £6.1 billion. They're wanting to increase our water bills by 6%. I'll speak more about them later. I am indebted to a number of individuals and organisations who have helped me with my research, amongst them the Save Our Swale Group, the River Trust's State of Our Rivers report, Sustain Alliance, Daniel Callaghan, and the Local Government Association, to name but a few. My lords, in Richmond, we're fighting back. Founded in July 2023, Save Our Swale Group was founded by a local resident, Deborah Mears. She held a meeting in our town hall, which was attended by over 100 people. Microbiologist Keith Thomas addressed the audience, as did Ron Wood from a local angling society. There was also a representative from the Rivers Trust. They were told that the Richmond sewage treatment works on the Swale at Richmond had discharged untreated sewage into the river for a total of 1,113,013 hours, and the number of releases was 371. The average time per release was 3.8 hours. This was during 2022, which your lordships will recall was a drought year. Indeed, in their standard precipitation index between March and August that year, they actually stated that the Swale was severely dry. Dry dumping, my lords, is illegal. The Save Our Swale Group are applying for designated bathing water status, DBWS, as this is the only way, if they're successful, of forcing the Environment Agency to regularly test the Swale's water quality. This is not a simple task, especially as DEFRA has recently yet again changed the criteria to make ultimate success less likely. The application will go in at the end of this year and the end of the bathing water season, and a mass of volunteers, a number of whom are scientists, and here I must declare an interest, my lords, as my husband is one of them, will be doing the Environment Agency's job for them by testing the water quality at various points along the Swale. This monitoring has been going on at 7 sites along the river on a monthly basis now since September 2023, and they have found unexpected and as yet unexplained spikes in phosphate levels above what are regarded as safe levels. It is clear, therefore, that the River Swale is polluted. Yet neither the Environment Agency, Ofwat, or Yorkshire Water appear to be doing much about it. After the Environment Agency began criminal investigations into non-compliance by water companies back in 2021, we, the public, are no nearer understanding just what is going on. Can the noble Lord the Minister advise me? Ofwat has also indicated it has enforcement cases against 6 water companies, including Yorkshire Water, but still these have not been made public. Perhaps the noble Lord the Minister can tell us what is happening and when we might see some transparency here. Before we left the European Union, we were signed up to the Water Framework Directive. This required member states to have good chemical and ecological status in their waterways by 2027. We were promised huge improvements to our way of life by leaving the EU. So can the Minister tell me where we are on these timescales, please? And could he also help me on what the government means by saying there is an exemption on this timescale until 2063? The Liberal Democrats put down an amendment to the Environment Act which would have placed a legal duty on water companies to make improvements. We're also calling for a sewage tax, as we have heard. And I quote my noble friend when she was speaking at column 754 on the 22nd of February. This will be a 16% tax on pre-tax profits, providing a £340 million fund to clear up the rivers that have been damaged and to fix the sewage system. End of quote. One solution, maybe, to this burgeoning problem. We should transform England's water companies into public benefit companies, abolish Ofwat, and put in place a new regulator with proper teeth to tackle sewage dumping, as we've also heard. I'm yet to see where the many improvements the government says it is making are being demonstrated. On the 22nd of February, the Noble Lord the Minister said that, and I quote, at column 759, the Environment Agency and Ofwat have recently launched the largest ever criminal and civil investigations into water companies' sewage discharges and into over 2,200 treatment works, following new data coming to light as a result of increased monitoring. End of quote. My lords, it is citizen scientists who are providing data and doing their work for them. And why did it take those agencies so long to see what should have been before their eyes? They have known about these discharges for many years. The minister went on to say, and again I quote him, "This government is going further and faster than any before to protect and enhance the health of our rivers and seas. We are holding water companies to account on a scale never seen before." End of quote. Well, of course, this has never been seen before. The water companies have been allowed to get away with committing environmental vandalism on a huge scale, all on the Conservatives' watch. This all comes down, I fear, to a board of directors who are perfectly happy to take huge sums of money, paying out £62 million in dividends in 2022-23 to its parent company, the Kelder Group, to, and I quote, cover costs including debt interest, close quote. It went on to say that the money did not go to external shareholders. Who are they kidding? They've paid £1.2 billion in dividends, as we have just heard, to shareholders over the last 10 years, whilst not even carrying out their primary functions of maintaining and investing in sewage infrastructure. Improvements we were promised in 1989. In August 2022, the Yorkshire Post reported that the Yorkshire water bosses paid themselves more than £3 million in bonuses, despite leakages running at 283.1 million litres a day. This is absurd. Bonuses should be banned today. My lords, it is said that in the 7th century, St. Paulinus baptised thousands of people in the River Swale. I wonder if he would have been happy to baptise people in there now, as sewage dumping in the Swale continues to be legal until 2050.
My lords, when I speak in this debate, I have a certain degree of nostalgia comes in, because I think I am, well, looking around the chamber, I am the only survivor of the Bill team that privatised our water industry here today. And throughout that process, and I don't dump this on the Minister himself, I was told by a variety of individuals, most of whom aren't in the House, don't worry, the regulator will deal with it. Repeatedly, if you raise a concern, the regulator will deal with it. They'll get in, they'll jump out, and we had it so often it almost became a joke. And those very late hours were very normal then. Getting up towards midnight, I wonder how many times we're told the next two groups, the regulator will deal with it. My lords, it's quite clear that model didn't work. That is what we're hearing. Now, it might be the fact that the regulator didn't expect to deal with what was going on, but we've had lots of chances and lots of different parties have had a chance to intervene here. My lords, we've known about global warming and the fact that warmer air means more water in it, and more water vapour in the air comes down as rain. We've known that's coming for a while, a long time. And just to remember, one of the last acts of the Baroness Thatcher as a Prime Minister was to talk about the fact that we don't own the planet, we are merely leaseholders on it, I think was the term. We've known for a long time this is coming, and yet we have permitted this model for the water industry to carry on that doesn't do anything. And at the times it was raised, my lords, I remember a cartoon when we finally went through that process. I remember it was after finishing at about, once again, the small hours, picking up, I think it was the Times, and a cartoon with a classic yuppie of the era, looking down at a computer screen, holding the thing, saying, "We'll all get filthy rich." Now, that was somebody who got it right. My lords, we've known this has been coming. And I would, just to say the fact that it isn't just something that is moved away from us and is a dreadful problem, but let's not worry about it, because it now starts to affect other bits of our lives. And the one thing that has caught me, it's been suggested by some of my colleagues here, but it is the fact that the leisure activities on water, and you would have thought that being able to canoe, fish, swim, go rowing, should be something you take, as read most of the time on a river or an inland waterway in Great Britain. Well, on the River Trent, then Nottingham, well, we have our National Training Centre. Last autumn, apparently, we had, this is amazing how the one thing I do regret about getting older is the fact of becoming long-sighted. My lords, it's the fact that we had 5,106 hours of training lost for our elite centre there due to red water notices. Think about that. And this is a stretch of water taken so that elite athletes can use it. Canoeing, open water swimming. And we have had cases recently, my lords, just to say how it affects people, of open water swimming where everybody got sick. Triathlon, World Championships, people got sick from their training programs. My lords, we have got something which is directly affecting human health here. Now, sporting activity, some people might shrug their shoulders and say it doesn't really matter that much. It's only a bunch of people running around, they can all go to the gym. But sport is a bit bigger than that. It's a representation of bringing people together, getting them outside, giving them a status in their own groups and a national pride in these cases of these athletes. If you can't keep a place like that safe for activity, or other types of activity lower down the sporting food chain, aren't going to happen either. When news of that gets out, somebody is going to say, do we want our child, our brother, our sister, our father to be anywhere near that water if it is actually dangerous? That would be something which I would suggest the government should take into mind. Then, my lords, let's talk about another group, the angler. The fact that we are affecting our waterways. Now, everybody should pay attention to anglers because there's an awful lot of them. Biggest group, participation group in the country, by a long way. And yet, we are doing something here, activities which are damaging the environment that allows them to function, to have that pastime. The food chain, the invertebrates, the various things that are coming down, the activities in there, everything will be reflected in that food chain to the angler. I would suggest that as a body, anglers do not punch their weight. I would hope that they would get out there and start to put a bit of pressure on government to go out there. It might mean that they have to work with the canoeists and rowers, who they don't like. They do disturb each other. But I would hope that somebody would come in and say, get together and make people listen. My lords, the historical analogy of the sort of great stink and the inspiration for Bazalgette is one which I hope we don't have to get to. I hope that other people can say there's a problem coming. Because, my lords, there is. It's starting to affect the smaller outlets. The fact that you have actually been making money, lots of money, out of the water companies, and you haven't even done the basic function of making sure raw sewage doesn't get into the water system, is unforgivable, my lords. The fact that you have failed in that basic requirement. Think about it, my lords. We knew it was coming. We knew higher rainfall was coming. We knew you were making money. Why didn't the regulator do something about it? If the regulator needs bigger and sharper teeth, more powerful jaw, if you want to follow the analogy through, I don't know. But I do know they do need encouragement to use those implements, to make it very uncomfortable for those. If we don't do this, my lords, this current model of ownership of water, let's remember, a natural monopoly. Water is expensive and heavy, you can't move it around the country. We're not without huge energy costs anyway. And unless you are actually going to make sure this pays, we are going to fail. And the cost to us all is a worse environment and probably worse health. My lords, surely that is worth making sure that the regulatory function fulfills its basic duty, and that those who run water companies can be satisfied with simply having a perfectly solid blue chip investment as opposed to something rather better.
My Lords, it's a pleasure to follow my noble friend Lord Addington and his very practical examples I really think are extremely useful in this debate. And I congratulate my noble friend Baroness Bakewell of Hardington Mandeville in explaining so vividly why the issue of untreated sewage going into our rivers is an issue. I want to turn to something slightly different, which is treated sewage, that's sewage sludge, and explain why that is still a problem for our rivers and land. Sewage sludge is recycled to land where it can act as a very useful fertiliser containing nitrogen and phosphorus and organic matter. And the regulation governing this dates from water privatisation in 1989 and is appropriately, its acronym is SEWA, but actually that stands for Sludge Use in Agricultural Regulations. Now those regulations are over 30 years old, and they were simply devised to deal with the human faeces element of sewage. But in the 30 years since, the water companies have been selling more and more of the services to industry. So the industrial effluent element of the sludge has increased, and so has the variety and toxicity of the pathogens, chemicals and heavy metals in the resulting sludge. That sludge is spread onto farmland, and in theory it should stay there, drilled into the grasslands that feed our livestock. Now, whether you actually think that toxic cocktail is a good thing in the grasslands that feed our livestock is a different issue, and one I won't talk about today. But what happens as the ground becomes waterlogged, like it has been for these last few months? Farmers are given guidance to avoid runoff. The guidance says they have a responsibility to make sure liquid sludge does not run off into roads, adjacent land, rivers or waterways. And if it rains heavily enough to cause runoff, then the spreading must stop. The guidance says spreading must not take place on frozen, waterlogged or very dry ground. But, my lords, with climate change, the ground is nearly always either waterlogged or very dry. Now, the Environment Agency were very concerned about this growing issue of toxic chemicals, and so they commissioned some consultants in the spring of 2015 to undertake a study of all this, and they worked with about 50 farms, and they also undertook a much wider paper trail review. And the Environment Agency's conclusion was that the trade in sewage sludge and other wastes had changed radically, making it much harder for the Environment Agency, the regulators, or farmers to know what was being spread on fields. So microplastics, pesticides, residues, all sorts of things. And the Environment Agency came up with a plan. They developed a strategy for safe and sustainable sludge use, which was published in 2020. And they explained why the regulatory changes are needed, because, of course, there have been many changes in the supply chain, industry feeding into the sewage sludge, and they identified the new hazards that were emerging. And they also said that modern sludge practices may harm the environment. So they proposed a number of things, particularly more soil testing and improved record keeping, more upstream sludge treatment, such as the sewage treatment works, and through trade effluent controls, which is a key, better storage and pre-sweat spreading control. So, my lords, they actually had a plan, because some of the elements that are in this sludge are very toxic. Zinc, cadmium, mercury, chromium, selenium, arsenic, antibiotics, dioxins, furans, phthalates, microplastics. And I'd ask the Minister, is there actually a legal limit for the amount of sludge that can be spread onto farmland? Who sets the limit, and has it been changed recently? As far as I understand it, there are no restrictions on using treated sludge on growing crops of cereals and oilseed rape. And treated sludge can be used on grassland so long as there is no harvesting or grazing within 3 weeks of use. Given that the list of toxins that I've just outlined, it seems 3 weeks is pretty minimal. So, my lords, there is a big issue here, and it is particularly an issue because all of those toxins can still wash out and do wash out into streams or get absorbed into the soil and so into the groundwater. The water company or supplier of the sludge is responsible for the testing of potentially toxic elements in the soil. And I'd like to know from the Minister how often that happens, and does his department actually see the results of this? The Duke of Wellington, who's not in his place, did ask that this shouldn't be party political. But the party political element to me of this issue that I've just raised is the fact that the regulator, being the Environment Agency, did actually suggest the solution, that we revoke the regulations from 1989 and bring it up to date with environmental permitting regulations. And there was a deadline set of 2023. Well, that simply didn't happen. And why not, my lords? Because the government could have put all this into the Environment Act, or, as the Environment Agency suggested, it might need a small additional legislative change. But none of that has happened, and that is a purely political choice. So that toxic cocktail will continue to be spread on our agricultural land, and a large element of it will continue to end up in our waterways.
Well said.
My Lords, I'm grateful to the House for allowing me to speak in the gap. I want to make 3 brief points while declaring my interest as living in the Mearn Valley in Hampshire and as a volunteer warden of the St Clair's Nature Reserve on the River Mearn, run by Hampshire and Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust. Baroness Bakewell, in her excellent opening speech, drew attention to the recent prosecution of Southern Water in our area. We're near neighbours. This happened on the 21st of July 2019, when 2 pumps failed, the sewage overflowed from a pumping station, and 3 kilometres of river were affected. The 2,000 fishes were killed, and the legal limit for the ammonia level was exceeded by 25 times. So it was a pretty serious instance. So it was shocking in what I know is quite a small stream. But what is particularly concerning is it took 4.5 years for the prosecution to come to fruition and the case to be resolved, which on the face of it looked like a pretty open and shut case. So one of the things I want to ask the Minister is whether they have considered in government whether this lengthy and expensive legal process is really necessary in this sort of case, and is it actually helping get the long-term issues resolved? Are the government looking at quicker means of resolution and dealt with so the industry and the regulator and the water companies can learn lessons quickly and concentrate on improving investment levels? That's the first question to the Minister. The second one is one of the problems actually that the Environment Agency is seriously understaffed and under-resourced? Hasn't it actually had, over the last 14 years, quite a lot of cutbacks in resources? And did this cause a delay in bringing this sort of prosecution? I hope the Minister can address this in his closing remarks. And thirdly, there are three significant chalk streams in my part of Hampshire: the Itchen, the Test and the Meon. The first two are pretty well known. The Meon is a lesser-known treasure. The Itchen and the Test are designated as areas of special scientific interest, which gives them extra protection. A local councillor in our area, Jerry Pratt, is leading a campaign for this designation to be granted for the Meon, and he's been told that Natural England are holding back on further designations, or they are short of resources to propagate them. So can I ask the Minister, is the intention to cover this issue in the review that I understand is being led on chalk stream strategy by the DEFRA Minister Rebecca Powell, when they finally publish their chalk stream recovery package? And when can we expect this to be published?
Yeah, okay.
My Lords, perhaps I could declare my interest as Chair of Cornwall and Isles of Scilly Local Nature Partnership. And I too congratulate actually getting the timing exactly right to my noble friend, because we heard within the last 48 hours that Thames Water has been lobbying the government to increase charges by some 40%, that the level of fines should actually be decreased, and that we should actually loosen up in terms of dividend control as well. And of course, that is there partly because Thames Water is very much under threat of itself going underwater, and that and its holding company. And perhaps the Minister would like to confirm or otherwise those conversations, and perhaps also, as my honourable friend Sarah Olney in the other place asked, does the government have a contingency plan for when, if in case Thames Water finally dies and does drown in its own debt? I think that's something that's very important to a very large proportion of the population of this nation. When I was a boy, although my noble friend Lord Addington being here during water privatisation, I didn't know that the House actually had people in short trousers at that time. But hey, he obviously looks far younger than he is. But when I was young, I used to enjoy board games, and my parents got fed up with me because I was far too competitive. And one of my favourite games was Monopoly. Oh, yes. But those of you who are Monopoly fans and players will know that one of the ones that you didn't want to land on was the water company, because it was boring, it had very low returns, and really what you wanted to do was get on the properties and be a real sort of red-blooded property developer and get those hotels on. And of course, in a way, before that privatisation, the water companies were exactly that. They were boring. They were a utility. That was their asset class, if you like. They had low returns. And I guess the first members of Ofwat, they had that in their mind. And they thought, hey, this is a fairly easy job. We're going to, we'll agree investment, we'll agree price increases, and frankly, after that, we can probably go home and it'll run itself. But what they didn't realise is that the people that were going to buy those purchases, and as sort of Lord Seeker will know well, they were private equity, they were really greatly into financial engineering, and they thought, hey, there's a real opportunity here, and Ofwat was nowhere near capable at that time of controlling or regulating that industry. I mean, you can say it was naivety, negligence, perhaps more, maybe that the people that were in there at the time did not really see that approaching. But the result has been that we have rivers that are indeed polluted and our waterways by sewage. And I just want to echo in some ways my noble friend Earl Russell about why are rivers actually important? Well, to me, I mean, one of the things I remember often used to be said in the social area was that, you know, you can tell how good a society is by how it treats its prisoners. Well, I would say you can tell how good an environment is by how the quality of our rivers is, because the rivers are the lifeblood of our nation. They are the veins of our nation. They support biodiversity. They have all sorts of ecosystem services. They clearly provide water. If they're not straightened, they can provide flood prevention. That is why they're important. They're also around human health. And because they are not healthy in all the ways that we have heard, then we have that challenge to both biodiversity and to human health. And those are the challenges that we're putting us here. And of course, we also have, as we know, not just effluent in terms of pollution, but as been mentioned by other noble lords, we have plastics, we have other urban waste, we have the phosphates that come primarily from agriculture. And I was glad, I think, the noble Lord the Duke of Wellington, who's not there at the moment, but mentioned elms. It seems to me one of the important things, and perhaps the Minister, as a DEFRA Minister, might like to comment on this, is that how do we allow and help farmers, the agricultural sector, to get out of this issue of phosphate? Will there be, through the ever-changing ELMS Environmental Land Management Scheme, will there be an exit route, a ramp-off that we can offer the agricultural sector to help on that? I think particularly there is also obviously the intensive parts of cattle rearing that are, I wouldn't say those companies are always the best in terms of environment, but generally the agricultural sector only reacts to its financial incentives that it's given by government. And so what way is there to do that? We've mentioned, a number of noble lords have mentioned the Environment Agency. I work in terms of Local Nature Partnership and some of the schemes that we're looking at the moment in Cornwall with the Environment Agency. And I would say I've never come across anybody in the Environment Agency that hasn't wanted to be on the right side of this argument, to be out there, to warn, to change, ultimately to enforce the fact that river health is really important. And yet, as a number of peers have said, Environment Agency funding has fallen substantially over the years. It started maybe to come up again in terms of environmental enforcement, but we are still way, way, way behind. And I would plead to the Minister, in the past, DEFRA has been a department that when the Chancellor says, I need some money, DEFRA usually put up his hand. Well, I think that should stop. We need to have Natural England and the Environment Agency well funded. I was pleased to hear also the mention of natural systems and the way that we should actually tackle this problem, not through hard concrete so much as through nature-based solutions. And it's talked about a lot. It can sound a bit like a cliche, but I really believe that this is the way forward. And if there are planning issues around that, if there are Ofwat regulatory issues about that, then that needs to change. That is one of the ways that we need to move forward. But I would again remind, from coming back from privatisation, that we've been through this process once before. I come from the southwest. When water was privatised, bills went up by 100%, more than that at the time. Households were really squeezed. So what we need here is a solution where we don't have, as Thames Water would want, bills to go up another 40% over the next few years. We need this to be financed in a different way. And with the squeeze that we have at the moment on household incomes, all of that side, then we need to find a different way to do this. And that needs to be through the water companies rather than through consumers. I just want to come back lastly to the regulator. After the financial crisis in 2013, the Financial Services Agency reputation was shot. And so the it was the coalition government at the time, 2013, decided that reputation has gone too far. We have to change, and so the Prudential Authority and the Financial Conduct Authority were actually brought in to actually have a new system. What I would say to the Minister and to the House is that I'm afraid Ofwat's reputation is shot. We need to have a different regulator, a far cleverer and adept regulator, and I think that would be one of my biggest asks, as well as my noble friend Baroness Bakewell saying that we need to bring these companies into some sort of social ownership. Absolutely, definitely. So, my lords, there's a real challenge here. The rivers are key to the health of our nation, to our population. We need to get those right. The noble Baroness Jones of Morscombe said you should pay them 50p. Well, can I suggest something different? If you go to the Monopoly Board and the water company is actually 2 spots before go to jail out of interest, but the cost is £150 on the Monopoly Board, maybe that'll do instead.
My Lords, can I start by thanking the noble lady Baroness Bakewell of Hardington Mandeville for bringing the debate forward today and for her excellent and very thorough introduction to this issue. Although, as she said, we have had this discussion a number of times over the last 12 months or so. Noble Lords have mentioned the data from the Environment Agency around the fact that only 14% of our rivers in England have a good ecological status, with no rivers in England having a good chemical status. Also, the House of Commons Environmental Audit Committee had a 22 report on water quality in rivers, and that said that getting a complete overview of the health of our rivers and the pollution affecting them is hampered by outdated, underfunded and inadequate monitoring regimes. Monitoring has been mentioned a number of times by noble lords. It also suggested that the current range of pollutants that are being monitored are too narrow, focusing on nutrients such as nitrogen, phosphorus and ammonia, but not routinely monitoring other substances that contribute to poor water quality, such as metals, pesticides, pharmaceuticals, industrial chemicals and plastics. I wondered if the noble lord knows if the government would consider monitoring those other substances. According to the Rivers Trust recent report, and can I thank the Rivers Trust for that excellent report, other noble lords have referred to it. The noble lord, the Duke of Wellington, hosted a meeting where we spoke to them, and it's an incredibly important report, and I hope the noble lord, the minister, will take account of what it says. But what that report draws attention to is the fact that, as noble lords have said, sewage and urban pollution, agricultural pollution and industrial pollution, chemical pollution, are all contributing to this problem. Looking at agriculture, according to DEFRA, it's the main cause of river pollution incidents in England, with intensive livestock farming being the major reason for the complete collapse of the River Wye, as we've heard often in this House, with the waste from the chicken, pig and dairy units also being routinely spread on land, untreated, adding to the problem. And of course, such has been the growth in the intensive livestock industry in recent years that the soils across England receive significantly more nitrogen and phosphate than they can actually cope with. They can't absorb it. So that excess then is contaminating our rivers and having an impact on our wildlife. But just looking at the River Wye, it's so concerning, of course, that the River Action Group has brought a judicial review saying that a loophole in the law is allowing poultry waste from 25 million chickens intensively farmed in the catchment to poison the river, but also that the Environment Agency and the UK government have failed to protect it from catastrophic decline. I think we all wait the outcome of that judicial review with great interest. In his speech to the recent NFU conference, Alan Lovell, who is the chair of the Environment Agency, said that pollution from agriculture and rural land is roughly equal to that coming from the water industry. But of course farmers who need to play a really important role if this is going to be resolved say that they need help with both expertise and financial support. The Noble Lord Teverson in particular talked about the help that farmers need if they're going to tackle this. The outgoing president of the NFU, Minette Batters, has said that farmers need better access to funding through the Environmental Land Management Scheme. The Noble Duke mentioned this during his speech, in order that they can create buffer strips along waterways, but also that they need much faster planning permission for slurry storage and incentives to grow the right crops in the right places. I wonder if the Noble Lord will look at the ELM scheme in light of these comments. And of course, our transition out of the EU Common Agricultural Policy into ELMS has been pretty challenging for farmers, with too much uncertainty, and this has also added problems. So the complicated current system has made it difficult. It isn't easy for farm businesses and land managers. They can feel lost in the system, and it's also been harder for them to think long-term, make long-term strategic plans. And I think we also need to look at cross-sector regulation. We can't just regulate the water companies, all the farmers. We need fair, transparent system where everybody understands what's happening and what role they have to play in reducing the pollution going into our rivers. And we're still waiting to see the promised land use framework to help balance all the demands we have on our land. And that includes land use to help with water quality and biodiversity targets. I just wondered if the Noble Lord had any update, or is it still just going to be published shortly? Chemicals, of course, cause a lot of the problems around the pollutions in rivers. Cleaning products, medicines, even the food we eat. Using chemicals clearly have a number of benefits, but when they leak into the environment, we know they can cause some really appalling damage. And we also know that they can persevere in the environment for weeks, months, or even years, causing significant harm to wildlife, particularly in fresh water and in the sea. A number of Noble Lords have mentioned the Rivers Trust report. One thing I wanted to pick up out of it was the work they'd done in collaboration with the Wildlife and Countryside Link Chemicals Task Force. They've recently analysed Environment Agency data on levels of just one of the many toxic PFAS forever chemicals. I hope I say this right, perfluorooctane sulfonic acid, or PFOS. And they've looked at that within English freshwater fish. And what this work has revealed is that the PFOS levels in English freshwater fish are on average 300 times higher than the levels considered safe by the European Union. I wondered if the Noble Lord was aware of that. If not, this is something that really needs to be picked up. We've also heard that much pollution comes from urban environments, the amount of plastic that we throw away. If you only got to look at your local river to see how much plastic can end up in it. We know that plastics break down into toxic chemicals and harmful microplastics, and then rivers become a major pathway for plastic reaching and polluting our coasts and our oceans. The Noble Baroness Lady Mackintosh of Pickering talked around road runoff as well, which again is very problematic. You get oil, diesel, petrol spills, plus the particles from tyres and roads wearing down, getting washed into our rivers and drains. And again, a really important area that we need to deal with. We know that urban wetlands, reed beds and other nature-based solutions can help intercept this runoff and reduce the pollution. And it is really important that the government properly invests in these mitigations. So what investment is the government making? Perhaps the Noble Lord could give us a clue. We've also heard an awful lot about the problems around regulation and enforcement. And I think that the poor quality of our regulation and enforcement in recent times has compounded all of this pollution that's coming from several different sectors, just making things even worse. The Noble Lady Baroness Bakewell, in her opening speech, talked a lot about England's sewage system being absolutely not fit for purpose, as have other Noble Lords, particularly the Noble Duke of Wellington. And we've heard again how over the past few decades, Ofwat has simply failed to ensure that water companies have invested sufficiently to upgrade or even just maintain our water infrastructure. So now, delivering the necessary improvements at speed and at scale to save our rivers has become a truly enormous task. So can I congratulate my noble friend, Lord Seeker, for his forensic analysis of the water company's finances. I think the work he did was very important, and I would encourage the noble lord to have a good look at Hansard, because I expect he may need to write to the noble lord at the end of this debate. But we do need more enforcement from the Environment Agency. But we've heard that the government has cut the protection budget hugely, in half in the last 10 years. We know that what's particularly concerning for me is that with the failure to monitor and investigate pollution incidents and the failure to enforce the legislation and rules that are supposed to protect our water environment, it's particularly worrying that this has included instructing EA staff not to attend low-level pollution incidents, requiring water companies to self-monitor and self-report. This is simply not going to get the change that we need. We need a strategic direction for water regulation. So I would just like to finish by asking the noble lord, on that point, the government's plan for water was published with great fanfare in April of last year. And that plan for water included creating a new water restoration fund that would be using money from water company fines and penalties that would be taken from water company profits, not from their customers, in order to support local groups and catchment projects like re-meandering rivers and restoring habitat, something really important. Nothing has appeared on this since. Could I ask the noble lord, the minister, to provide an update on when we are likely to see this? Because if the government is going to make great announcements and publish lovely plans, they are no good if what they say is going to happen doesn't then actually happen.
My Lords, I declare my interests as set out in the Register, and I congratulate the noble Baroness Bakewell, on securing this debate, and to noble Lords for their valuable contributions. It might be helpful to remind noble Lords that the combined water and wastewater infrastructure that is managed by water companies is a system designed by our Victorian ancestors and does allow, as it has done for over 150 years, for sewage to be spilled into our rivers at certain times and under certain circumstances, as Baroness Pinnock described so well. This may not be deemed desirable or even acceptable today, but it is a reality from which we cannot escape. In heavy rainfall events, of which we have more and more, there is a binary choice between sewage going into our rivers or backing up into our homes. I make reference to this to differentiate what water companies are legally allowed to do and what I suspect Baroness Bakewell and many other noble lords are mainly seeking to address, which is the illegal spilling of sewage in our rivers, as well as how to address reducing sewage spills altogether. I think that we can all agree with the comments that the noble Viscount Stansgate made last week in a similar debate, that the volume of sewage going into our waters is not what any government, or indeed any member of this House, or the public would wish. And we rightly expect to see the quality of our water improve and for water companies to play their part. In tackling this challenge, it is really important to be clear that there are both legal and illegal discharges of sewage, as I've already explained, and that the government is taking action to reduce both. I will, however, heed Baronesses Jones and Baroness Hayman's advice and spend my weekend rereading Lord Seeker's speech and preparing to write to him on his detailed accountancy questions, and to the noble Baroness Jones, on the number of water companies operating illegally and blocking developers. In April last year, the government published the Plan for Water. We're delivering this with tighter regulation, tougher enforcement, and more investment. We committed to the 25-year Environment Plan to restore 3/4 of our water bodies to be close to their natural state, and this plan will help us to achieve that by directing £2.2 billion of new accelerated investment into vital infrastructure to improve water quality and secure water supplies. This includes £1.7 billion of funding to tackle storm overflows. This is on top of the water companies investing £7.1 billion on environmental improvements between 2020 and 2025, which included £3.1 billion invested in 800 storm overflow improvements, such as the Thames Tideway Super Sewer. Storm overflows that are causing the most harm are being addressed first so that we can make the biggest difference as quickly as possible. We're the first government to address and implement 100% storm overflow discharge monitoring so that the public and our regulators can see exactly what the water companies are doing and set clear targets to them to significantly reduce legal storm sewage discharges. We expect water companies to use the next 5 years price review period, PR24, to set bold and ambitious plans that deliver on this plan for people and the environment. This means cleaner rivers and beaches, fewer leaks and supply interruptions, and substantial improvements to tackle storm overflows. In addition, the Storm Overflows Discharge Reduction Plan, published in September last year, will see the toughest ever crackdown on sewage spills, driving the largest infrastructure programme in water company history. Around £60 billion of capital investment over 25 years. Companies will upgrade storm overflows individually depending on how they impact the targets that have been set out in this plan. Meeting these targets will result in hundreds of thousands of fewer sewage discharges. By 2035, we will have protected all of our designated bathing waters and the vast majority of our most sensitive and protected habitats from storm sewage discharges. And by 2050, there will be an 80% reduction in all storm sewage discharges. This government is the first to face up to the fact that as a country, we need to fundamentally change how we deal with sewage. That cannot change overnight and will come with some cost. Eliminating all discharges could cost up to £600 billion, increasing annual water bills to an unacceptable level. The government is committed to review the targets in the Storm Overflow Discharge Plan in 2027 to establish if companies can go further and faster to achieve the storm overflow targets without hiking up bills to unaffordable levels. If they can go further, the government is clear that they must. These initiatives work alongside a raft of other measures to improve the quality of our rivers and seas. As a result of our work, 90% of designated bathing waters in England met the highest standards of good or excellent in 2023, up from just 76% in 2010, despite stricter standards being introduced in 2015. Last week, we announced that we would consult on 27 potential designated bathing sites in England, the largest number that we've ever consulted on, and encourage all interested individuals, businesses and organisations to respond to the consultation by the 10th of March this year. Both Baroness Jones and Earl Russell referred to nutrient neutrality. On the 25th of January this year, we designated catchments in which water companies will be required to upgrade wastewater treatment works to reduce nutrient pollution by 2030. This will help to unlock the homes communities need, whilst also reducing pollution at source. This government is also committed to increasing the quantity and the quality of sustainable drainage systems, usually referred to as SUDs, in new developments, as my noble friend Baroness McIntosh mentioned. SUDS reduce the pressure on our traditional infrastructure by slowing down the overall amount of water that ends up in the sewers and storm overflow discharges. The review and decision-making for SUDS and the decision for making SUDS mandatory in new developments was published on the 10th of January last year. A public consultation on the implementation proposals will take place shortly, and I'm encouraging my department to progress this as quickly as possible. My noble friend, Baroness McIntosh and Baroness Haymond, raised points on the roads. In the Plan for Water, we committed to reducing pollution from roads by improving water quality through the Road Investment Strategy 2020 to 2025, and so far, National Highways have delivered over 30 water quality initiatives. It is important to make clear that National Highways are not responsible for pollution from roads. These are managed by local highway authorities. My noble friend is also right that we must improve water efficiency, and will be pleased to hear that we have a new legally binding target under the Environment Act 2021 to reduce the reduce the use of public water supply in England per head by 20% by 2037/38. To help meet this, in our 2021 written ministerial statement, Government set out our approach for a range of water efficiency measures, including our mandatory water efficiency label, leakage and metering. As for fixing misconnections, water companies have the power to lay, inspect, maintain and repair or alter pipes falling on private land, and I will write to the noble Baroness about access to government land. I commend my noble friend for her tireless campaigning for farming and their part in storing flood water. Since 2015, we have also protected over 900,000 acres of agricultural land, along with thousands of businesses, communities and major infrastructure via our flood investment programs. In addition, there will be measures that benefit flood risk mitigation in all three environmental land management schemes: sustainable farming incentive, countryside stewardship and landscape recovery, which will include payments that relate to floodwater storage. Moving on to the issues raised about the Environment Agency. The government's work is backed by enforcement action from the regulators. Where there is evidence of wrongdoing, the Environment Agency and Ofwat will not hesitate to hold water companies to account. In 2013, government directed water companies to increase their storm overflow monitoring. In 2010, only 7% of storm overflows were monitored. As of December last year, we are now at 100%. This has given us a clear sense of all discharges, which we never had before. In answer to Baroness Bakewell's question on who is responsible for monitoring storm overflows, it is the Environment Agency. The Environment Act also requires water companies to monitor the operation of storm overflows and the water quality upstream and downstream of their assets. This is helping regulators to identify and enforce storm overflow discharge offences and permit breaches. We are also providing an extra £2.2 million per year in this spending period for the Environment Agency, specifically for water company enforcement activity, and we have legislated to introduce unlimited penalties on water companies who breach their environmental permits and expand the range of offences to which they can be applied. Last week we announced that we are significantly increasing our oversight of the water industry. Every water company should expect their wastewater treatment sites to be regularly inspected. The number of inspections, including unannounced inspections, will rise to 4,000 by the end of March 2025, a fourfold increase. Our consultation on increasing permit charges for water companies to enable these inspections is underway and due to close shortly. This will be backed by around £55 million per year. More inspections will allow the Environment Agency to conduct more in-depth audits to get to the root cause of incidents, reducing the reliance on operator self-monitoring. Since 2015, the Environment Agency has concluded prosecutions against water and sewage companies, securing £150 million in fines, including a record £90 million fine for Southern Water. These will go into the Water Restoration Fund to protect and enhance the water environment, and as the Noble Baroness Hayman mentioned, I will report on that date shortly. Moving on to Ofwat, Baroness Bakewell and Lord Seeker and Baroness Jones questioned the effectiveness of Ofwat and the Environment Agency. The Environment Agency, with Ofwat, has recently launched the largest criminal and civil investigation into water company illegal sewage discharges at over 2,200 treatment works, following new data coming to light as a result of increased monitoring introduced by this government. In May last year, Ofwat announced that its enforcement capacity would be trebled following the approval of £11.3 million of additional funding by this government. If water companies fail to meet their statutory or licensed obligations, Ofwat can issue an enforcement order or financial penalty of up to 10% of a company's turnover. Following their 2023 annual water company performance report, Ofwat published the financial penalties and payments for all water companies. Ofwat have required 13 companies to return £193 million to customers for underperformance in the 2022-23 year. This money will be returned to customers through bills over the 2024-25 year. Ofwat have also required each lagging company to prepare service commitment plans outlining the actions they will take to deliver the levels of service customers expect. Ofwat has reviewed these plans and is regularly engaging with companies over them. Just this month, the Environment Secretary announced that Ofwat will be consulting on banning water company executives from receiving bonus if a company has committed a serious criminal breach. The consultation will seek to define the criteria for a ban, which we expect to come into effect later this year. This could include successful prosecution for a Category 1 or 2 pollution incident, such as causing significant pollution at a bathing site or conservation area, or where a company has been found guilty of serious management failings. I will, however, consider Baroness Jones's suggestion of community service for the chief executives. This builds on Ofwat's announcements last year to tighten restrictions on bonuses using powers given to the regulator through the Environment Act. Baroness Harris asked about the open investigations into Yorkshire Water, and I'm afraid I'm not able to comment on those or indeed any open investigation. Lord Addington brought up the issue of anglers. As the past chair of the Atlantic Salmon Trust, I have the greatest sympathy with him and indeed with anglers. He also mentioned that they might start to bring some pressure to bear on the government. Well, with the Rivers Trust, Wild Fish and Fish Legal and many celebrity anglers, they are indeed already applying considerable pressure, I can assure you. And I should add that as a keen angler, I'm not against canoeists at all. Baroness Miller asked about the testing of sludge, and this is regulated by the Sewage Sludge Use in Agriculture Code of Practice. Lord Stoneham referred to an investigation with Southern Water, and I'll look into the speed of that response and what can be done to speed these things up in the future. He also commented on the chalk stream strategy, and the Plan for Water recognises chalk streams as a government priority and identifies action to protect and include them in the publication of the Chalk Stream Recovery Pack. And this recovery pack is due to be published later this year. I'm hoping it's going to be about midsummer. And will set out the government's policies which act together to address the key pressures on chalk streams from abstraction, agriculture and wastewater. Lord Teverson raised the issue of Ofwat and the monitoring of water companies, and the government remains confident with this approach, with Ofwat's approach, and has contingency plans in place in the event of any public service failing. Lord Teverson also brought up other points relating to farmers and farming, And we are taking significant action to work with farmers to reduce diffuse pollution and deliver improved environmental outcomes. We've doubled our catchment-sensitive farming budget to 15 million per year, thereby enabling farmers across England to receive face-to-face advice on recurring water and air pollution issues. We've also budgeted for an additional 50 Environment Agency farm inspectors to work with farmers to meet their legal obligations. Our environmental land management schemes are being rolled out to pay farmers for the delivery of environmental benefits that include activities to improve water. Baroness Hayman asked again about the land use framework, and I'm afraid it's the same answer. It's going to be published shortly. And I think that's about all I can say on that at the moment. My Lords, as I've set out, this government is going further and faster than any other to protect and enhance the health of our rivers and seas. We have set out clear targets for water companies, and we are holding them to account on a scale that has never been seen before, and making sure the Environment Agency and Ofwat are equipped to take enforcement action where there are failings. This government is fully committed to addressing the historic issues that are causing pollution in our waterways, and we will continue to strive for healthy and thriving water environments.
My Lords, I thank all those who have taken part in this debate, and especially the Noble Lord the Minister for his response, and appreciate that he has inherited this problem. And I thank him for his very detailed response, and which I shall study in Hansard. We've had a very varied debate, and at the same time there has been much agreement across the Chamber in condemning the overspills of sewage, when there has been no unusual weather conditions requiring it. Until quite recently, water companies have discharged sewage and untreated water on hot sunny days with impunity. And we have heard how this has affected different people, and I believe that we may possibly be on the cusp of a change. I'm grateful to my colleagues who have spoken so passionately and knowledgeably and entertainingly on this subject. It is often overlooked that at the point of privatisation, water companies were debt-free, and Baroness Jones of Moulscombe and my noble friend Baroness Harris of Richmond also raised this. And I would just like to say that I think Lord Seeker makes a really excellent forensic accounting contribution, and there is a role for you in another place if you should decide that this is enough. Although the water companies were debt-free when they went private, that has changed when the new private owners saw the glint of money for themselves and borrowed money to increase share dividends. Not all water companies followed that course, but many did. Some invested in the infrastructure, but this was often based on concrete solutions instead of the cheaper, more carbon-efficient, nature-based solutions. And Baroness McIntosh of Pickering has been campaigning for nature-based solutions for a considerable time, and the Noble Lord, the Duke of Wellington, who's not in his place, has also campaigned for this. I'm grateful to the Noble Lord Teverson for raising the issue of farmers and phosphate discharge. Farmers do have a role to play in improving the quality of our waterways at the same time as producing food, and the Noble Duke of Wellington referred to the role of farmers. My Lords, I don't intend to return to the debate and run through it, every contribution, but I do want to draw attention to one particular contribution. My noble friend, the Baroness Miller of Chilthorne-Domer, has referred to the sewer sludge, and many of the chemicals which she listed are what is known as forever chemicals. And we need to deal with this problem because it is extremely worrying that these chemicals should be on the land and on the land forever.
Yeah.
My Lords, all sides of the House are concerned about sewage pollution of river and waterways, and the Noble Lord, the Minister, refers to the Victorian sewer infrastructure, as did my noble friend Baroness Pinnock. However, surely it is time that we had a better solution than the Victorian sewers. The regulator is not fit for purpose and does need to be replaced. I'm not sure it is comforting to know that everyone agrees in the House on this issue, but the power in numbers is considerable, and I do hope the Noble Lord, the Minister, is listening and will act accordingly, although I know he is doing as much as he possibly can. But it is time to introduce more stringent measures to improve the quality of our water, which should be crystal clear and gurgling in the streams instead of brown, sluggish and smelly.
The question is that this motion be agreed to. As many as are of that opinion will say content. Contrary, not content. The contents have it. Questions on a statement made in the House of Commons yesterday, Ukraine update.
If you don't want to read it out, I don't mind. No, it was it yesterday? Okay, on. I think, was it yesterday? Yeah. No, same time. Apologies for that. My Lords, the barbarity of the Putin's regime is evidenced by Ukraine's bombed-out cities, the raped civilians and the children kidnapped to Russia. Ukraine's resistance in the 2 years since Putin's full-scale illegal invasion is a testament to the courage of its people. 2 years in which Ukraine has retaken half the territory seized in 2022 and pushed back the Russian Black Sea Fleet, demonstrating the pretense of Putin's attempt to claim that Russia is winning the war. As Andrew Mitchell said yesterday, we understate the extent to which Putin is being beaten back. And although the Russian advance into Advika did take place, those 2 kilometres cost between 40 and 50,000 Russian deaths. My Lords, our message, Labour's message to Ukraine is simple. Whoever is in government, Britain will support Ukraine until it prevails. We support the further and significant military and financial support the government have announced. But the war must be a wake-up call to all of Europe. There is more that we, along with our allies, must do together. The fact that South Korea is sending more shells to Ukraine than the whole of Europe combined is a telling point. My Lords, we also welcome the French President bringing the world leaders together this week. And yesterday, Minister Mitchell stressed that the United States' support is absolutely vital for Ukraine's success. He also said that he was hoping Congress will follow the lead by passing the relevant bill swiftly following its return from recess. I hope the Noble Lord can reassure us on that point this evening. This morning, the Noble Lord the Minister reassured the House the government was working closely with European Union on our collective security. As David Lammy said yesterday, Labour has outlined plans for a new UK-EU security pact to complement NATO ties and strengthen the whole continent. And certainly Labour welcomes very much Sweden's accession to NATO, which strengthens the whole of our alliance. But can the Noble Lord tell us what recent conversations has the Foreign Secretary had with his NATO counterparts regarding a pathway for Ukraine's membership? We certainly welcome the sanctions against 6 individuals that the UK announced in the wake of Mr. Navalny's death. And yesterday, in response to David Lammy's concern on the range and enforcement of sanctions, Andrew Mitchell said we will be introducing an ability to sanction ships. Could the Noble Lord the Minister tell us what the timetable is for this? Last December, an Office of Financial Sanctions implementation report showed that there had been 0 enforcement measures for the post-February 22 sanctions breaches in relation to Russia. Andrew Mitchell said that actually in response to that point that last week a Turkish company, 3 Chinese entities and 2 Belarus entities were sanctioned. But can I ask the Noble Lord the Minister, why not consider every individual on the full Navalny list? Why not support a new international anti-corruption court? And certainly, why not support Labour's whistleblowing reward scheme to crack down on enablers? This morning I raised with the Noble Lord the issue of the EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen's statement yesterday on using interest on Russian state assets, frozen Russian state assets. And Andrew Mitchell said yesterday that, I quote, "I hope that in due course we will have more to say on that specific provision." Now, I suspect I won't get much more out of the Noble Lord tonight, but can he just give us a bit more detail on a time frame for this? Because these are urgent questions and resources are urgently needed. Also yesterday, Brendan O'Hara raised the $2 billion from the sale of Chelsea. And again, Andrew Mitchell said that there is immense frustration that the Chelsea fund is not out and operating at this time. He said, "We are doing everything we can within significant and irritating levels of difficulty to get it deployed, and we will do that as fast as we possibly can." Well, again, this is money that is urgently needed to support people in Ukraine. I hope the Noble Lord can be a little bit more reassuring tonight that we will resolve this matter as speedily as possible. Can I also ask what support we are giving to the ICC in preparing a case against Russia for deliberately targeting and bombarding civilians? I think, again, this is important in terms of holding those to account for the responsibility, for their responsibility to committing these crimes. Finally, my lords, can I welcome the government highlighting the case of Vladimir Kara-Mirza's case, and I know my right honourable friend David Lammy met his wife today. Can the Noble Lord give us an update on the case and what we are doing, and also to reassure us that there won't be any backtracking on this, and that we are taking specific steps. So I hope the Noble Lord can update us on that.
My Lords, I would like to thank the Noble Lord the Minister for bringing this statement to this House for us to address this evening. And we are indeed, as the Noble Lord, Lord Collins, has made clear, agreed across all parties in our support for the government and in support of Ukraine against the aggression of President Putin. We're 2 years on, and I remember the start of the war. At the very start, I was linked to a vice president of Ukraine, as she was from a sister party. On WhatsApp, she sent me a list of military hardware which was urgently needed. I have never before received such a request, certainly not weapons and body armour, on WhatsApp. I forwarded this shopping list to the Noble Lord, Lord Ahmad, and I'm grateful that, as ever, he took this forward. Fortunately, I have not received any further military shopping lists, and direct and appropriate liaison is clearly happening with the UK government. But this showed the desperate situation Ukraine found itself in. So where are we 2 years on? Putin will not have anticipated this, but they are well dug in the east of Ukraine. Having been at the UN for a parliamentary hearing last week, I noted unanimity on needing a ceasefire in Gaza, but less global support for Ukraine. We know that the increase of food prices and fertiliser caused by the invasion has negatively affected countries around the world. We know that there are more populist and authoritarian regimes around the world watching Russian actions with interest. See the actions of Venezuela against Guyana. China will be watching too. It makes it even more important that we assist Ukraine and that we make every effort to ensure that Putin is not allowed to succeed. Could the noble Lord tell us what discussions we're having internationally to help further isolate Russia, in particular with our Commonwealth partner India, who's been taking oil from Russia? Sanctions have been used to try to have a major effect on the Russian economy. At first, this seemed to have an effect. Then the Russian economy seemed to bounce back. What is the government's assessment of whether, with oil prices where they are, these sanctions will bite harder, and what they anticipate within the Russian economy? And are we nearer in terms of redirecting funds from oligarchs to support Ukraine, as mentioned by the noble Lord Collins? President Zelensky has flagged a lack of ammunition. How are allies scaling up production? What encouragement can we give to the US Congress to move things forward as far as the United States, a key ally, is concerned? Russia has regressed so dramatically in terms of human rights in recent times. The murder of Alexei Navalny shows that Putin, ahead of elections where he has total control already, clearly does not care what the world thinks, but sends the warning that he will kill opponents, whether in his prisons or in other parts of the world. Are we effectively gathering material to take to the International Criminal Court on crimes, these crimes and others, but particularly those against women and girls in Ukraine? I hope that our security agencies are focused, especially prior to the elections here, in the US and Russia and elsewhere, on threats emanating from Russia. I've no doubt the noble Lord will not answer that directly, but nevertheless I hope that that is the case. We have a Foreign Secretary who has experience on the world stage. I hope that we are using those skills and experience effectively with the rise of global tensions in the Ukraine and the Middle East, in Ukraine and the Middle East. He may only have a few months in this particular role, but this could not be a more key time. I look forward to the noble Lord the Minister's responses.
My Lords, may I firstly thank both the noble Lord Collins and the noble Lady Baroness Northover. In doing so, it's nice to see the Baroness Northover back in our trilateral conversations, debates and discussions. And I also thank them specifically for the strong support. We've previously said the importance of acting as one, and I think that's been reflective on the ability in terms of our diplomacy. The noble lady mentioned my noble friend Lord Cameron. Indeed, the noble lady herself served in the government under the noble lord, and I agree with the noble lady that it's been not just on Ukraine but on many global issues, including the Middle East. The ability to work together with someone who has the stature, the experience and the insights that the noble lord, the Foreign Secretary, brings to this brief is extremely important. I do recall quite directly her text that she referred to, and it's been reflective of the strength of support we've seen from Ukraine in terms of their real sense of affection and appreciation for the United Kingdom. And as I alluded earlier this afternoon, only yesterday when I met with the Ukrainian ambassador in Geneva, she again articulated that the friend that stands out most amongst all, and there's been many, many friends that Ukraine can count, very much in the top category, the United Kingdom is seen in that light. Why? Because we were there not just when the shocking events of 2 years happened. We were there when Crimea was annexed, when Crimea was invaded, and we've been consistent in our military support through the support we've provided through Operation Orbital. The noble lady asked specifically about the support on militarily, humanitarian, the fiscal support, and we're very proud that, again, on the munitions point that the Noble Lady raised earlier, as I said, we've provided a further contribution in this regard. And of course, we're working, I assure the Noble Lord Collins, with all key partners. My noble friend, the Foreign Secretary, attended the conference in Paris, and there was representation from over 27 countries. And this was about ensuring that was an attendance at senior level, but also to ensure there is strong coordination with partners in support of Ukraine. Turning to some of the specific questions that have been raised. First and foremost, on the issue of sanctions, which both the Noble Lady and the Noble Lord referred to, we do continue. The UK on sanctioning individuals, including the recent sanctions we've announced. There are now 2,000 individuals and entities under the Russian sanctions regime, over 1,700 of which were sanctions since the full-scale invasion. On the 22nd of February, the UK announced more than 50 new sanctions to further diminish Russia's capacity and weapons arsenal. And I note what the Noble Lady said about the economy of Russia, but what we have seen is some real challenge. And even today, Russia continues to announce the need for more people to be recruited into its army, because the cost on Russia has also been immense, not just on the economy, the 400 billion that has been denied to its war chest, but on its people. And I'm sure I speak for the Noble Lady, the Noble Lord, indeed all in your Lordship's house, that our fight is not with the Russian people. And indeed the shocking nature of what was referred to earlier by both the Noble Lord and the Noble Lady, which was the death of Alexei Navalny. This was a focus of my speech yesterday at the Human Rights Council, and I assure the Noble Lord, Lord Collins, that on Vladimir Kara-Murza's case, again, there was a specific call, and I echoed that call at the Human Rights Council, that Russia should do the right thing, immediately and unconditionally release this British citizen. And we will continue not just to advocate, but to demand the release of this British citizen and ensure families can be reunited. In Alexei Navalny's case, we welcome finally that at least his remains have been released to the family, and of course Noble Lords will know, as I understand it, the funeral will take place tomorrow. Noble Lords, also Noble Lady and Noble Lord, raised the issue of sanctions enforcement. The government has rightly committed £50 million to support its new economic deterrence initiative, which strengthens our diplomatic and economic tools. We have acted specifically, and as I've said before, in terms of sanctioning against particular companies. In August 2023, a UK company was fined £1 million in relation to unlicensed goods in breach of Russia sanctions. And of course, I accept what the Noble Lord Collins is saying. We need to remain vigilant to ensure that where there's loopholes and sanctions are being circumvented, whether it's home or abroad, that we seek to act. But I also add the point, though, which I know both the Noble Lady and the Noble Lord appreciate, that the most effective way on sanctions and to prevent sanction circumvention is also to act in unison with our partners both in the United States and in the European Union. The Noble Lord Collins and the Noble Lady raised the issue of US funding. I assure both the Noble Lord and Noble Lady we've been at the forefront of imploring the US to make sure it continues its support of Ukraine. We welcome the US Senate's passing of the National Security Supplemental Bill, and it's noticeable it was with a significant majority as well. And we do hope, as the Noble Lord Collins asked earlier, that the House of Representatives will pass this bill swiftly when it's returned from recess. My right honourable friend in the other place did say that US support is vital, and I agree with him. It is vital when you see the level of support, but equally important is that our other allies, including those within the European Union and within NATO, also step up further to see what support, further support they can give to Ukraine in this respect. My Lords, the Noble Lord asked about Chelsea funds, and I again share the frustration. There is work being done every time I see a sanctions debate, SI, etc., is to make sure that we are focused on this. The Noble Lord Collins will appreciate the need to be legally watertight on whatever actions we take, but we are working very closely with our colleagues in His Majesty's Treasury to ensure that we can move forward in a way which does ensure those current frozen funds are utilised in support of Ukraine. I know we are discussing Ukraine, and rightly so, at quite regular and short intervals, but it demonstrably shows both the continuing support from your Lordship's House as demonstrated today, but equally important about the dynamic nature of this ongoing war against Ukraine. And therefore it's vital that we recognise some of the supporting the initiatives of some countries who have sought also to engage quite directly. It was the United Kingdom which, for example, encouraged, and we were delighted that the Foreign Minister of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia was able to visit Kyiv last year and also announce humanitarian support. And of course we note that President Zelensky has been visiting that region, including the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia recently, and it's important we widen the scope of support for Ukraine, and we will continue to do so.
My Lords, I welcome the statement and the leadership role the government has played in supporting Ukraine from the very beginning. I also welcome this week the fact that the final obstacles to Sweden joining NATO have been cleared, which is another powerful strengthening of the alliance as a result of Putin's invasion. The Lords European Affairs Committee, which I have the privilege to chair, published a report a couple of weeks ago on the impact of Ukraine on EU-UK relations, and we took a lot of evidence in there on sanctions policy and the seizure of assets, which is the next big opportunity, frankly, to help support the financing of reconstruction in Ukraine. The Foreign Secretary, when he gave evidence to us, did say that there is a legal route to doing this in terms of seizure of assets. And as has already been mentioned, the EU are looking at the seizure of windfall profits of assets, although the real game changer would be to get at the underlying assets themselves. It's important we work in cooperation. I wonder if I could just press the Minister a bit further. Can he assure us that we're working closely with the EU and the US with the aim of getting to a place where we can start doing this quickly, because the needs in Ukraine are obviously very pressing?
My Lords, in thanking the Noble Lord for his insights, he of course brings great experience to our discussions this afternoon, this evening, and I agree with him about the importance of coordination, and yes, I can give him that categorical assurance that we are doing just that. Earlier this afternoon I did state to your Lordship's House about dealing with also the key agencies and institutions involved with the assets. The Noble Lord will know that of course Europe works differently to the United Kingdom, but when we have previously announced we have about £8 billion of assets here in the United Kingdom, and ensuring that those assets are utilised in terms of its interest element. We are very much seized of the work that the European Union is doing, and seeing how that may be replicated in the context of the United Kingdom. But I add again the importance, and just that caveat, in doing so we need to just ensure that whatever action we take is legally robust.
My Lords, does my noble friend share the concern that I feel after the reports of Putin's State of the Nation speech today, in which he states that he has no intention of invading Europe, but he doesn't exclude the option of using nuclear weapons? That, I believe, behoves some response from Her Majesty's government. How does my noble friend expect the government to respond to that scenario?
My Lords, what I'd say to my noble friend is nothing surprises us or shocks us in terms of what Mr. Putin articulates. And it's not the first time he has articulated such comments. It is irresponsible, it is wrong, and the use or the threatened use of such weapons is frankly quite deplorable. Whether he's using it with intent or as shock tactic, I can't speculate on that. But what I can say, and I'm sure I speak for everyone in your Lordship's House, that the last thing anyone wants to hear right now is the use of threatening to use such weapons. What we've seen over the years, from the time of the Cold War, the subsequent relationships that developed positively during Mr. Gorbachev's era, was a real recognition that the deterrent value of those weapons was clear, and we pursued it in that light. Mr. Putin himself could reflect on his own history and that of Russia to see that the only way forward on this is to ensure that he pulls back now. he brings about peace on the continent and stops the war on Ukraine.
I congratulate the noble lord in the effort that he and the government is making to help Ukraine. I would like, in addition to what we've so rightly doing to help them, I think we have to recognise the damage and the disaster that's been caused in many parts of the country, and the fact that there's an awful lot of voluntary work going on in this country to try and support them. I named just two which I happen to be involved in. One is the Global Ukraine Rail Task Force, which tries to raise money in Europe, here and in the United States, and Network Rail has contributed to that. It's been very helpful to keep the railways going, because the railways are absolutely essential in Ukraine. It's a very big country, passenger and freight. What's come to me is that it's difficult giving them bits of second-hand railway goods because we've got different gauges and everything, but what they've worked out is that they want second-hand buses, second-hand coaches, and also old railway equipment, which they can use as shelters, medical centres, play areas and things like that, to try and replace what's been damaged. And I don't know whether the noble Lord the Minister could encourage not just the railway companies, but the bus companies as well, to look into sending second-hand, disused, no longer used, equipment to Ukraine to help them rebuild their communities, in addition to resisting all this horrible bombing. But one of the problems that I hope he can deal with is we're having a war in Europe, effectively, and it's very difficult getting things across frontiers and getting some of the permissions that are needed to get into Ukraine. And anything he can do to help that will also enable organisations like, another one is SHAP, the Swindon Humanitarian Aid Project, getting this equipment there and trying to provide some voluntary support for the people in Ukraine who've had their buildings crashed. But I hope he can do something on that.
My Lord, I appreciate that the noble Lord brings his valuable insights from transport into this, and he touches on an important issue about, it's not just about the transport system, it's the recreational element as well, that there is a whole generation impacted in terms of children in Ukraine, and what more can be added. I recall my first visit as the war started to Poland, and there were some very valuable examples of what civil society and community groups were doing. Indeed, the noble Lord may recall that the structures of the international system, particularly the UN bodies, were not equipped or set up to deal with the kind of conflict we were seeing in Ukraine. No one desired such a conflict to happen. And whilst that was being stood up, it was the community groups who were providing vital links. I remember a Polish charity group going in and saying, we load up our minibus, we take whatever we can, we go as far as we can, and then we load off where we can. And that was reflective of the real spirit of community, which is very much in evidence here in the United Kingdom. And of course, I'll look into this. There are, of course, challenges of security. There remain real concerns and challenges in terms of any attempts that, as the UK has done, on reconstruction within Ukraine, that Mr. Putin, as we heard earlier from my noble friend, uses no stone unturned to not just threaten, but then also act, as he's done on missiles, even recently in Kyiv. So there is no safe part of Ukraine for Mr. Putin's war machinery. But of course, we remain committed, and that's why we hosted the Recovery and Reconstruction Conference. And as that evolves, and one hopes this dreadful war is brought to an end by Russia stopping the war and Ukraine again being an independent sovereign state in terms of all its territory, that we can also look to see how we can best support in terms of transport infrastructure and indeed explore recreational support for the next generation of Ukrainians as well.
My Lord, in the context of the terrible death of Alexei Navalny, the noble Lord the Minister has referred to Vladimir Kara-Murza. I've also had the opportunity to meet with his wife, Evgenia, and I know how much he appreciates what the British government has done to try and champion her husband's cause. Given what the noble Lord has said to us about having raised this as recently as the last few days at the Human Rights Council of the United Nations. Has he got a plan for what more can now be done at every opportunity to raise his plight? May I also ask for Noble Lord the Minister, in the context of the point made by the Noble Lord Collins about sanctions, and specifically the point Brendan O'Hara made yesterday in the Commons about Chelsea Football Club. I have a written question on the order paper today specifically about that. I would hope that when the Noble Lord comes to respond to that he might also deal with the amendment I moved to the Proceeds of Crime Bill that the government accepted in spirit and said they would bring forward secondary legislation. How is that going? And are we able to reclaim as much as we can from the oligarchs who funded and aided and abetted so much of what Putin has done in Ukraine? And my other question to the Noble Lord, building on his patience earlier today when he was good enough to meet with the Noble Baroness Lady Kennedy and myself and Amal Clooney to talk about accountability, but in the context of Yazidis, can I ask him about the international crime of aggression? I met with Philippe Sands recently, the author of the wonderful book East West Street, which is based in Lviv and looks right back in his own family at the relationship between his family and that of Raphael Lemkin, who after all was the author of the Genocide Convention. At the discussion that we had, we heard more from the Ukrainian authorities about the international tribunal that is needed to try the crime of aggression. The British government has insisted in the meantime that there should be a hybrid tribunal. This doesn't seem to be going anywhere very fast. We all want to see those responsible held to account. So where are we up to in resolving that issue? I said to the Noble Lord, the Minister earlier on, we all regard him as having the patience of a saint and are extremely grateful to him for the way that he engages on these questions.
Perhaps I could extend that patience to the great Lady Ahmed as well. I think she has endured much over the years. Picking up on the specific points, of course, I raised the case quite directly at the Human Rights Council, and rightly so. I assure the Noble Lord we will do so, not just through international fora with those countries that have direct influence over Russia. It's important we leverage that, and we will and are. And of course, we retain our diplomatic presence in Moscow, and we will also use that bilateral level of engagement at a diplomatic level through the ambassador and his team to ensure that this remains very much at the top of our priority list in terms of what we demand from Russia. The Noble Lord talked about accountability, and I was conscious of time earlier, but I assure both the Noble Lord Collins and the Noble Lady Baroness Northover, as well as the Noble Lord, that we're fully engaged on the issue of accountability directly with Ukraine. I work very closely with the Prosecutor General on the specific requirements. I know the Attorney General of the United Kingdom is also very much fully engaged on the support that Ukraine need. We work very closely with the prosecutor Karim Khan at the International Criminal Court, and again I commend his efforts and indeed real courage in when he issued those arrest warrants against the Commissioner for Children as well as the Russian President, and I think that was an important step forward, and we're working in a very collaborative way there. The Noble Lord asks about the International Tribunal. Of course we are aware there are about 3 or 4 different versions of that, including derivatives thereof, and I assure the Noble Lord recently I just asked for a kind of summary of what are the pros and cons of each approach. We understand the call that Ukraine has made, and of course we want to work with international partners in ensuring the model that is presented is something that is consistent with and complementary to existing arbitration and not arbitration accountability measures, but at the same time that we understand fully that this crime is investigated and perpetrators are brought to account.
My Lords, the Noble Lord the Minister speaks of working with our international partners, and I absolutely endorse that. But in response to Baroness McIntosh's question, he reiterated his view that we've heard before, that one mustn't give in to Russian threats. Not giving in to Russian threats also involves working closely with partners to accept that we need to look forward and work cooperatively. So I wonder if he can tell us why His Majesty's government have dismissed within minutes the suggestion from President Macron of France that perhaps we will need to do more to confront Russia in Europe. And we may well need to have to defend ourselves. The fact that the government dismissed this so quickly, the only leadership we've seen in Europe recently has come from France. I'm afraid to say that Germany, of which I know quite a lot, the Zeitenwende policy, has not delivered the pivot that we expected to see. So I'm extremely sorry, and I wonder if he might reflect that when you rule out options so fast, you also run out of options. That's the risk you face.
My Lords, on this particular point, I'm afraid I have to disagree with the noble lady. We work very closely with France and all our European allies. The noble Lord Ricketts alluded earlier to the NATO membership of Sweden. It was only we use every opportunity. I said to my noble friend, Lady Baroness Fall earlier, that I knew I was going to meet the Hungarian foreign minister. That brush by in India was the moment to actually endorse the need for Hungary to act and expedite the engagement directly with Sweden, but also their accession to NATO. The United Kingdom has shown nothing but leadership on the agenda, and I am surprised by the noble lady's call. Of course, we work closely with France. We evaluate what our allies will say and ensure that we move together on this. And I'd be the first to say, and I'd be surprised if the noble lady was to ask directly, not that I expect she would be able to, but the Russians directly. Quite often, when they challenge the West or indeed attack the West, there are two countries which are at the forefront of that, both beginning with U. One is Ukraine, directly, and the other one in Europe is the United Kingdom.
I wonder whether I might go back to the Minister, since we still have a few minutes. Perhaps the noble Lord the Minister will recall that it was the United Kingdom that signed, was a signatory to the Budapest Memorandum that gave security guarantees to Crimea, and it was the United Kingdom exactly 10 years ago. It was February when Russia invaded Crimea, 10 years ago, and the United Kingdom stood idly by. So I suggest a dose of humility might come handy occasionally.
I'm afraid, again, if you look at the history of Crimea and indeed 2015, if there was one country that has stood consistently with Ukraine, it's the United Kingdom. I believe we're the first to accept humility as an endearing aspect of anyone's character. And I'm sure on this particular occasion, the noble lady may find herself in a minority of views here. The United Kingdom has been consistent. Who was the one who provided military support and training to Ukraine? The United Kingdom. And that was done in 2015, and it's continued since then. Who was the one to first point out that the Russian invasion was imminent? Amongst two countries. One was the United States, the other was the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom has led on economic support, on military support, on humanitarian support. We have 140,000 Ukrainians in the United Kingdom. When we say Slava Ukrainia, we mean it, not just by words. We also walk the walk, we talk the talk, and we deliver.
My Lords, I beg to move that the House do now adjourn.
That the House do now adjourn.
The proceeding has ended.